Welcome back. Okay, today we're going to look at chapter 2 called Prisoners. But wow, what an ending to chapter 1. I've got a feeling those girls are in a little bit of trouble. And let's find out why Granny was on the boat. If Granny was on the boat, and if she wasn't, how did she just get there? It's a mystery. Let's find out. Prisoners. Betty sat rigid with shock and confusion. Next to her, Charlie was also frozen, her hand clamped around Betty's arm. Bunny hadn't been on the boat when they'd left. Betty was convinced of it. But now she'd had doubts. Could Granny have disguised herself? It was impossible that she could have boarded them without seeing her otherwise. But then why would she let the boat leave? It made no sense. "Granny," Betty whispered. Already the folds of her disbelief, she knew what this meant. Any future glimmer of freedom were now in tatters, as impossible to grab as the swirling mist. "How did you... Where did you come from?" "Never you mind." Granny glowered down at her. She looked half mad with her grey hair flying loose from its bun, her shabby coat and shawl and her Wellington boots. Horribly mismatched. Worse still, Granny had bought the ugly old carpet bag that she insisted on carrying everywhere, though goodness knows why. Betty began to feel grateful for the fog. It was, at least, a screen against curious eyes. Clearly the only ones that had awaited her audaciousness were embarrassment and confusion, not adventure. She now needed a new motto. "Return this boat," Granny demanded. "We're getting off." "Well, that's what I'm trying to do," the ferryman snapped, not looking up from the windrows that he was bent over. The other passengers squinted, their eyes flickering over what they could see of Granny's strange appearance, as though they were trying to work out what kind of Halloween costume she was wearing. Betty cringed. "Hurry up, please," Granny repeated loudly. "This is no place for children." "Well, you're the one that brought them," the ferryman said. But then he frowned. "Although, come to think of it, I never saw you get on." "Nonsense. I've been here all along." But she can't have been, Betty thought, bewildered, or she would have said something sooner. She bit back a frustrated growl. All that sneaking about, that effort, was now for nothing. She didn't feel like a big adventurer now. She felt like a silly little girl. And worst of it, there was a tiny part of her that was relieved, because in all those misty moments before Granny had appeared, Betty had been a little bit scared. "But Granny," Charlie whispered, "you haven't..." "Shh," said Granny, in a not at all quiet voice. Now the ferryman peered closer to Bunny. "I remember the girls getting on, but I don't remember you. You didn't pay for your fare." "I most certainly did." Granny's voice cooled a few degrees. "Or do you suppose that I swam here, fully clothed, and boarded the boat still dry, like some miracle?" She narrowed her eyes. "And don't get lippy with me, young man. I know your father." The ferryman looked more alarmed about this than he did about the fog. "He's in for it now," Charlie said in a small voice. "No," Granny snapped. "You two are in for it when you get home, and this time you'll be getting more than you bargained for." Betty gulped. She should have known better than to try and trick Granny. After all, she'd never managed to do it before, and now some other unpleasant thing was now in store, to add to her already ruined birthday. "What's that supposed to mean?" Granny didn't answer. Instead, she said to the ferryman in an even sterner voice, "Now I suggest you stop quibbling and get these cold, damp people back to safety. I expect many of them will want to know why the ferry was permitted to leave in the first place if the fog was expected." But it wasn't," the ferryman objected. "Then you must be terribly inexperienced," Granny said coldly, "or too fond of money." She looked away pointedly. The ferryman had now stopped protesting, and after consulting the windrows once more, began rowing meekly. No one said a word for the entire journey back to shore, but Betty could feel the tension building in Granny. She might be silent now, but there was no mistaking that once they got off the boat, she would have plenty to say. But so did Betty. Something extraordinary had happened, and neither Granny's temper nor her punishment was going to stop Betty asking questions. Just how had Granny got onto the boat? True, she had always possessed an uncanny knack for tracking the girls down if they spent too long on an errand or wandered further than they should while out mushroom picking. It was a running joke that Granny would pop up like a sniffer dog. But this time, Betty found nothing funny or logical about it. Instead, she felt a little creepy sense of uneasiness. When the boat docked, Betty and Charlie were shivering, both from the freezing air nipping at their ankles and from the shock of being caught. Granny looked the opposite, hot, crossed and bothered, a bit like a dragon, with her breath coming out in quick bursts that misted the air. She made them wait until everyone else had got off before they clambered ashore and headed for the lanes leading back to the Poacher's Pocket. Betty looked back at the misty marshes. Sometimes the fog would come all the way up to the land, wreathing its way through the streets. Tonight, however, the fog stayed at the fringes of the water, hovering like a marsh creature protecting its lair. When she was certain the other passengers had gone and the Widdershins were alone, Betty spoke. "How did you do that, Granny? How did you get on the boat without us seeing you? It is not possible." "I was there on the boat the whole time," Granny answered shortly. "But you were so caught up in your little adventure, you didn't even see me." Betty stared, trying to read Granny's face, but all she saw was anger, something which normally stopped her from asking too many questions or answering back. But tonight wasn't normal. Her hopes and plans had all been dashed. She had nothing else to lose by saying what she really thought, even at the risk of being punished with extra chores. "I don't believe you. You wouldn't have waited all that time before saying something to us." "Well, I wanted to see if you would actually go through with it," Granny snapped. But she still didn't quite sound truthful. "Or whether you'd come to your senses and turn back." "Come to my senses?" Betty's face grew hotter as her temper rose. Or perhaps it was the string from Granny's harsh words. Bringing Charlie out here like this was stupid and irresponsible. Anything could have happened. "Exactly," muttered Betty. She ignored the prickle of shame, unable to hold her tongue now as she had begun. "We might have even had some fun." Granny ignored her, pulling the shawl tighter around her. She jabbed her finger between Betty's shoulders, prodding her along the lane. "I thought I could count on you, Betty Widdershins. I thought you could be trusted, but it looks like I was wrong." "That's not fair." Betty's voice rose, carrying through the night. "All right, I shouldn't have gone behind your back. But come on, Granny. Wanting a bit of freedom? That's not a crime. And you know I'd never let Charlie come to harm." "I know that's what you think," Granny cut in. "But you're 13 years old and you know nothing of the world. There are plenty out there that could harm you, things you don't even know about." "Well, I never will if you don't let me." Betty spoke quietly now, but with as much defiance as she dared. Granny's fierceness was normally enough to stop her answering back, as well as a feeling of not wanting to be a bigger burden than they already were. But enough was enough. She waited for her grandmother to protest, to make the usual promises about taking the girls on trips and holidays, but this time Granny didn't. She looked terribly tired and then even older than usual. A guilty, worried lump now rose in Betty's throat. Granny was, after all, the only one that had looked out for Betty and her sisters. If she hadn't been there to take them in, the girls would have ended up in the orphanage, or worse, split up and rehomed with strangers. She pushed the thought away. Being grateful shouldn't stop her from getting some answers. "You say you can't trust me now, but you never have. Not to go out of Crowstone anyway." Granny stamped over the cobbles. "Leave it, Betty. This time isn't the time or place." She set off at a pace, one hand clutching her shawl, the other clutching the travelling bag. Betty grabbed Charlie's hand and hurried after Granny, determined not to be brushed off so easily. "How did you find out?" "The flyer," Granny said shortly. Betty closed her eyes in dismay. Early that day, Fliss had seen a hidden flyer fall out of Betty's cloak and had picked it up, frowning. "What's this? A Halloween fair at Marshfoot?" "Oh, Betty," had said, her heart quickening. "I asked if we could go, but Granny said no, of course." "Well, of course," Fliss had echoed, holding the flyer a fraction too long before handing it back. "Fliss snitched on us then, didn't she?" Betty fumed. "Or did she just leave it there for you to find?" Granny now avoided the question, pausing to hitch up her stocking. "It's lucky you didn't cover your tracks more carefully." "Luck? Luck?" Betty stopped in the middle of the road. Luck was the last thing she felt after having her adventure snatched away. Why didn't Fliss want to escape the everyday drudgery, or care about Granny controlling them anymore? Granny halted up ahead. "Stop dawdling," she scolded. "Come on, Betty," Charlie begged. "I'm cold." Betty released her sister's hand, her own slowly forming her fist at her side. Keeping the Halloween fair flyer had been careless, and now it would be even harder than ever to plan any secret trips with Granny watching her every move. But plan she would, and the next time it would be flawless. Heck, the next time she might not even come back at all. Footsteps cut across the silence, and then Granny was in front of her. "Stop sulking. I don't want any more trouble when you get back. None of this is Fliss's fault." "No," Betty curled her fist. "It's yours." "I beg your pardon," Granny said. Her voice was dangerously low, but still Betty persisted. All her pent-up resentment and frustration, all the time she'd been told to stay close to home, the way Fliss had shut her out recently, it all came pouring out. "Fliss used to want to explore as much as I do," she said. She pulled the mask off her face, cold air hitting her cheeks. "She used to plan all the places she would visit, but not anymore. She's 16. She should be allowed to go wherever she wants, but she's given up, and it's all because of you." All of a sudden, Granny seemed to shrink in her baggy clothes as all the anger went out of her. "That's not fair." "No, it's not." Tears pricked Betty's eyes. "All your stories of what-ifs have stopped Fliss from trying. You've squashed the adventure out of her. I won't let that happen to me or Charlie." Granny shook her head, a strand of hair unravelling like Granny herself was coming undone. "It's not like that." "Then you need to explain," said Betty, hardly believing the words that were leaking out of her now. "Why all the broken promises and the excuses? You act so tough. Maybe you're the one who's too scared to leave." Granny lowered her eyes, unable to meet Betty's. "We've been out of Crowstone plenty of times. You were just too young to remember." "I don't believe you," Betty said. Her voice hardened as she became more certain. Now she really thought about it, there had always been something odd about Granny's reluctance to let them go anywhere. And her hold only seemed to tighten as the girls got older. It felt all wrong. I'd remember, and wouldn't there be pictures, memories of special days out, and there's nothing. Granny didn't answer. "Betty," Charlie whispered, "please stop it. I want to go home." "Why?" Betty said bitterly. "What's the big rush? Home is all there is." She jabbed a finger in the direction of the prison. We're no better off than the prisoners in there." She glanced around at the crooked little streets, hating them. "And it might not be tonight, but I will escape this place. There's more to life than Crowstone." "No, there isn't," Granny said. Her eyes were haunted. "There's no leaving this place. Not for us." Her words dangled in the air like sharp little needles, and Charlie began to cry. "Not for us?" Betty echoed. Surely Granny was just trying to scare them. How could they not be able to leave? Do you think you're ready for the truth? Granny asked sadly. Betty stared back helplessly. She wasn't sure. Not now Granny was as good as admitting that Betty had been right all along. But all she could do was nod. Very well. Granny slowly nodded. I'll tell you. No more secrets. She shuffled closer, resting a hand on Betty's cheek. But I warn you, it's nothing good. Charlie huddled closer to her, crying harder. Betty's mouth went dry. Was this the link to the rat bag father somehow? Were they being punished along with him, forbidden to leave like the people on Torment? It was all she could think of. What is it then? Tell me. Not here. Granny lowered her hand, her jowls wobbling as she glanced about them. This is only a short journey, but I need you both to keep your wits about you. We mustn't be seen. Not seen, Granny. You don't need to understand. Just hold on. Granny hooked her arm through Betty's, the carpet bag dangling from her wrist. Link your arms with Charlie. That's it. Nice and tight. And whatever you do, don't let go. Betty wondered if she'd finally sent her grandmother loopy. Why else would she be acting so peculiar? Granny, you're scaring me. Yes, well, I can't help that. And you're going to find out sooner or later. Granny tightened hold of Betty's arm. A familiar smell of her tobacco and beer was warming in the chilly air. Ready? For what? Betty asked, bewildered, as Granny opened the bag. Her grandmother didn't answer. Instead, she reached inside the monstrous carpet bag and turned it inside out, saying in a crisp voice, Poacher's pocket. Betty's insides gave an enormous lurch, like that she'd fallen from a great height. Her ears were popping and her eyes were forced close as a huge gust of icy air rushed past her, knocking her off her feet. She heard Granny gasp and Charlie do a funny little moan, but she kept holding on to them both as tightly as she could. Her balance was gone, her feet finding nothing but air. Granny! She wailed, her eyes flying open as she toppled backwards and landed with a bump, arms still locked with her grandmother and Charlie. Hard cobbles bit into her bottom, and the whistling wind had been replaced with the rowdy voices and laughter. Betty looked up in amazement to see that all three of them were now sitting in the doorway outside the Poacher's pocket. Not one of my best landings, I admit, but I'm not used to passengers. Granny released Betty's arm and got to her feet. Oof, my hips. After dusting herself down, she checked over the carpet bag and then snapped the clasp shut with a nod. We're home. And we're going to leave it there. Wow. Now we know how Granny got onto the boat. So, just a little thing. What do you think Granny is about to reveal to Betty and Charlie? And do you think Fliss, her older sister, knew about this all along? So, that was the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called The Three Girls. And we'll come back later to find out what happens and what Betty finds out about her granny. And maybe we'll find some magic in this. See you later.